I wonder if we could bring all of our panelists now onto the view. We'll have, as I said, we're going to go a little bit past 6:30, and I have some questions for our group because this is such an important topic. Um, and one of the things I want to kind of think through in looking at the way our government operates, what should be the balance of power between states and the federal government when it comes to voting, when it comes to access to the polls? And just to a little bit of background, we do have institutional challenges right now in the way our government works. We have counter majoritarian structures like the Electoral College. We talked about this, like the US Senate, where we know that, the two senators from a 40 million person state, California, have the same two votes as two senators from Alaska or Wyoming, which has less than a million people. Those are counter majoritarian structures. So, how do we reconcile states' rights and federal rights when it comes to voting? And I'm going to open it up to whoever wants to go first.
Ms. Green?
I can. I think one of the things the federal government can do and learn from its history, when states can determine who can vote, they're not going to protect and expand to all. So having some protection that if we just enforce the 14th Amendment, that if you are suppressing groups, you're supposed to get limitations on representation, those later amendments of that particular one clauses, and also to return pre-clearances, because states alone and in its long history are not capable of doing it. But on the state level and on the federal, on the other side, as I like to tell my family, especially you live in Massachusetts and Northeast, we need to start paying attention who's in our state legislatures, because they do a lot of things. And so if the federal government's looking at our state legislature and they're supposed to be the representative of the state, they have a lot more power and sway. And this is where those redistricting maps using algorithms to go precisely and breaking up Black power, that same race neutral, which we know it's not. We need to restore that balance, but I think the states alone can't do it because we have authoritarian stance that's translating to the federal, but also to where on the ground, it's not just what happens every 4 years, but what happens every elections from the county commissioners and those legislative to the legislatures to the federal. So I think we need an overhaul, but enforcing what are American values and voting rights and who can vote. And our laws are clear on that. So making sure those rights are actually protected and then worked on the ground to reform from it then.
I would say that there are two things I think we need to do. Number one, I think we need to understand that legislatures are the ones that make the laws. All right, because there are three different branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. Legislators make laws, but it is the judicial branch that interpret the constitutionality of those laws and if they are lawful or not. What we're seeing now, especially with the last administration, was the appointment of judges all across the spectrum that will slant that point of view. And that is where I think we're going to lose in terms of our ability to gain. Because you now have judges that, in my opinion, really don't even know much about the law. And they know that they have one intention. That intention is to make sure that I have the echo in the ear of my party and I want to keep it. It's not about the law anymore. It's about who can maintain control. And we must fight that. All right. And another thing that I think that we need to do is we need to understand that freedom, and I keep harping on this, that freedom is not free. Just because you think you can do something today, there is no law that has been made that cannot be appealed. And if you got the right judges, I've always contended for the last 10 years that we are one vote away from losing our freedom.
I would just add to, I think, the very thoughtful comments offered already is that there needs to be a rebalancing of the federal and state power, or the exercise of power. And we've seen this rebalancing throughout American history. Professor Green was talking about the Reconstruction period of the 1860s and 1870s. And what happened was states' rights gone amok, and thus civil war. Over this question of states' rights and whether or not states could allow slavery to exist and expand to the Western territories. The federal government said, no, we're going to put standards down for who's a citizen, who can vote, and so forth that come out of the Reconstruction Amendments. We said in the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and so forth, states' rights gone amok, and saying, we're not going to abide by the Brown decision. We're not going to desegregate. We're not going to let people vote. And the federal government has to step up and say, the United States is not 50 separate nations doing their own thing. It's a single government, and it's under a federal government. And when we have individual states that are out of line with federal policy, the federal government will assert itself on behalf of the greater good. So I think we're in one of those moments in which we see individual states, Georgia, Alabama, Arizona, to the extent North Carolina, doing their own thing and saying that the state says you need an ID, the state says you don't, the state says we're gonna have drop boxes, the state says we're not gonna have drop boxes. It's right for the federal government to step in and say, again, we are the United States, this is the United States, and not just 50 separate states doing its own thing. And we're gonna have a unified standard in regard to who's eligible to vote, and perhaps on early voting and what happens in a pandemic, and mail-in voting and so forth. And we can't leave this up to the states to do it, because they're not. We've seen this movie before, right? they can't be trusted, at least all of them, to do the right thing. In the federal government, if you're going to have a national government, this is the moment. This is the kind of moment a national government steps in and asserts what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be an American, what sort of rights and privileges Americans should have, regardless of what state you find yourself in.
I want to add just one more thing, Jennifer, if I can.
Go ahead.
There is an even bigger monster out there than just voting rights, and that is voting election nullification. We had better pay attention, because it ain't gonna make no difference who casts the vote. If you have a board of election in your county or in your state that now has the authority to nullify a legal vote and declare their own winner because they thought, don't make no difference what nobody else said. They could have said it was the cleanest election in the world. But if they come up and say, well, we had so many people casting votes out of precinct, we think that was wrong, and it was even more than that. So we're going to nullify that vote, and we're going to declare our own winner. Your democracy is gone. So election nullification is that big monster that we need to fight on our local level and on the state level. And pre-clearance, if we have to do a standalone bill in Congress, pre-clearance, not just for Southern states, but for all of the states now, need to be done.
Thank you, Robert, for reminding us that it's not just what happens up to Election Day and on Election Day, but also what happens with those ballots after Election Day, and all the certification and all the hands and authorities that get involved as well. Someone told me once that Democrats focus on what happens before the election and the day of, whereas Republicans are focusing on after, because they know that kind of annulment can be the ultimate power. I don't know if that's a good way to divide, but the whole thing, before, during, and after, all those aspects of voting are incredibly important, and there are loopholes and challenges at every stage to ensure that we have fair and free and universal access. We haven't even gotten into other kinds of voter suppression and exclusion, such as convicts and people in jail who haven't been convicted and their access to the polls. I mean, there's so many other ways. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get to something positive. And there was a great question that was asked that was very much in line with what I was going to ask. That came in through Q&A, and that was, how do we educate people to understand what can the average person do? What organizations are out there that are following this closely that can help guide people so that we can all be advocates for our universal voting rights, especially when it concerns people of color who have been discriminated against and left out of power and of having a voice in how they are governed for way too long in way too many ways. What can the average person do? And whoever wants to go first.
I think what Mr. Wilson was saying earlier about education, he gave us 3 pillars, and I like them. There was an economic one in regard to capital, there's another in regard to protecting the vote, and then there's the education piece. And I think the education piece has probably been the one that's been the least paid attention to in regard to civic education. And just coming through school and people knowing that there are 3 branches of government, knowing that there's a Secretary of State of North Carolina, but there's also a U.S. Secretary of State in Washington, D.C., and it's not the same job. Knowing how what gerrymandering is, and how it's an attempt by politicians to pick their voters as opposed to allowing voters to pick their politicians. So I think there's a huge educational opportunity here that needs to start early on in K through 12, so that when people reach voting age, they're one, prepared to vote. I think people need to be prepared to vote, not just every 4 years, like a lot of us are. A lot of folks are just voting every 4 years in the presidential election. We need to be in the habit of voting every year and a few times a year. We need to be prepared to vote in the primary and in the general election every year, which is, that's how you get a situation in which our presidential years look different than the off year elections, whereas these big swings in which a party does well, and then that every 4 years that we have presidential election, and then that party just falls through the floor in regard to getting out their voters for the midterm elections, and a large part of that has to do with the fact that people are not in the habit, especially working class people, people with low wealth, people that don't have childcare so they can stand in line to vote for a long time, can't get off the job to go vote. So I think that there are ways in which we could have true civics lessons embedded in the curriculum from kindergarten forward, so that people understand it's a complicated system, as we just saw in 2020. Who ever heard of the Electoral Count Vote or the Electoral Count Act, or knew what the vice president's role was or was not, or knew what this little official in Michigan could do to overturn, or so I think that there are a lot of pieces, or the Electoral College and how it operates, Ms. Roberts, in ways that are not majoritarian. I don't think that people understand how the Senate operates in ways in which you have a big state like California with 40 million residents with 2 senators, and then Wyoming with about 700,000 with 2 senators. There's no planet on which that's democratic, in which that's majoritarian. So I think if more people knew about how the system operated, I think more people might be outraged about it and want some reform of the system. But I think there's a big educational task that needs to take place. K through 12, the parties need to be on it, the professors, the clergy, need to be on in regard to the educational lift that has to take place. And then there has to be a cultural change. People need to be prepared to go out and vote in off-year elections. They need to be prepared to vote in primaries in addition to the general election. And again, every year, not just every 4 years. People need to think of every year as a year in which I'm going to vote.
I would add a couple things and what we've been doing, because everyone thought Doug Jones came out blue. No, it was grassroots organizing, going back to that civil rights case and taking people to the polls and educating on how to get a ballot, how to read a ballot, how to get a voter ID so you can vote. Where's your polling place? And then more importantly, that primary in which Doug Jones eventually won on a special election, that was mobilization with Emerge Alabama and different coalition groups of women. You have to run for office too. If there's no one running and you only have one person there and it happens to not be your party, you need people to have competitive elections. That was one of the first competitive elections I saw. So even running for school board and different things like that. But the education and the freedom school model of the civil rights movement is something that I have seen in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. LaTosha Brown, Stacey Abrams, that long game, it doesn't end on election day. It just begins there. So you're constantly having a new cohort of voters and getting them in, but also listen to the real world issues. I drive students to the polls because they don't have cars. I'm like, okay, meet you here, pick you up, take you to the poll. I'm sitting in my car with my coffee because I've already voted, and I bring them back. That's the type of thing. I think this is where we have enough elders, people who were in those campaigns, who are still alive. And this is where I think we can do that intergenerational shared community schooling plus K through 12 and everyone. This is all hands on deck, including we need someone to run for office. So I'm not going to volunteer anyone. We need people to run for office.
Well,
Go ahead,
I would agree with you that and I'm very much hardcore in terms of the value of education, because education to me is the key to basically everything we do. Yeah, and I would tell you that, and having been a history major in college and being a history major at a HBCU, you kind of saw it from a different perspective as it was being taught. And when you look at what the foundation of slavery was built on, almost 240 years of free labor, it was built on three things. It was against the law to educate slaves. It was 60, if you were caught educating a slave, it was 67 lashes. All right. Number two, it was against the law for slaves to vote. And it was against the law to pay slaves. That is how you maintain a system of slavery for 240 plus years. Because without those three things, you cannot function. It is impossible to do in this society. Yeah. And I would tell anybody that education is the key. We have got to go back to the fundamentals. And the fundamentals is reading, writing, and arithmetic. And we have got to learn that. And we have got to make that a fundamental basis for which we are now going to go forward. You can't go forward without the past, because the past is a measuring stick to the future. Without it, you are repeating yourself. And I would tell you this lastly, but history is critical. But understand what history is. History is, in fact, a story of his or her story being told by that individual. That does not necessarily make it fact. It is a story being told. It is amazing to me when I listen to people talk about how history has been a part of our society. And I always tell them, there can be no future without the past. because the past is the measuring stick to the future. So we must understand that history is in fact his or her story being told by them. That does not necessarily make it true. That's why we have such a fight today over critical race theory. Critical race theory has never, ever been taught in high school. And in some college, they didn't even teach it. In fact, most schools, it was in law schools. All right. So they took that idea and ran with it and said that it made people feel bad. How in the world could telling a fact make people feel bad? I do not understand. But then to tell that big, humongous lie that we were teaching it in high school and elementary school is even worse. And nobody wanted to say, no, we didn't.
I think I'm going to have to start calling you Professor Wilson. We've gotten lots of history, reading, writing, math, and history this evening. And wow, we certainly have a lot to think about. It is good to know that there are things that the average person can do. There are a lot of organizations. I'm actually working with the Carter Center right now on trying to, lower the temperature around our polarization. A lot of that is racial polarization. It's that group status downgrade that many white people are feeling, that they're feeling like they're losing that power, power they never should have had to that extreme in the first place. But we are having these conversations around how do we bring America back together? How do we recognize that our futures rise and fall together? That we cannot, if anything has shown us that, a pandemic should have shown us that. And yet we remain polarized around basic science of vaccines and wearing of masks. So there are many organizations that are working to bring people back together, to recognize there is more that connects us than that separates us, that the pie is growing. Just because you are gaining in status doesn't mean that I'm losing. It means we're all gaining. And we have organizations like the Carter Center, like the League of Women Voters, like there's a group called You Can Vote in North Carolina that's reaching out to young people. That education you talk about, they go into the high schools, they go into the colleges, they tell people, they actually walk them through what a ballot looks like. How do you go into the voting booth to vote? Make a game out of it, get it exciting, bring it home, make it relevant to their lives and to what they see going on around them in terms of healthcare and the university system. All these things have voting rights have an implication for what's happening around all of us. It touches all of us. There are, other organizations, Democracy NC, which has poll protectors, people watching to make sure folks aren't being intimidated at the polls. So there are a lot of good folks doing a lot of great work. And my hope is that our conversation tonight has encouraged people to be present, to be educated, and to take action. Sign up for some of these mailing lists. Sign up to get information on voting rights, on the new districts we have. So many of these organizations are helping citizens know, has your polling site changed? What can you do about that? How can you help get people to the polls? That is exactly what we need to be doing.